everybody to an incredible scholar and a very good friend of mine, Dr. Alecia Magnifico. Alecia so you're an assistant or associate professor, I forgot.
I'm an associate professor. I got tenure this summer.
Woo! Wow, congratulations. That's very impressive. Very well deserved, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a long road, but it's good.
It is, yeah. It's a road work. I mean, I still got like about 3 more years to go for full, so I'm still racing myself.
Yes.
Yeah. So Dr. Magnifico was an associate professor at the University of New Hampshire. She does a lot of work on literacy and political research, and I have invited her to talk to you. I mean, she and I we do a lot of talking in other circles, including chocolate. I'm sorry.
Do you see I'm wearing a scarf today, Raul, just for you?
Oh, that is very sweet of you, Alecia. Did you make it yourself?
I did.
Oh, yeah, but she's really good also at dating. She does beautiful work like scarves and sweaters. And this has nothing to do with political research, but it has everything to do with political research. It doesn't.
No, that's true.
Yeah. So I have invited Dr. Magnifico to talk to us today and share some of her experiences dealing with research design. I mean, when we had the initial conference call to talk about this meeting, I told her that all of you are in the middle of creating your research proposals, and that you're all in the middle of finding that topic, finding that theme, and also worried because sometimes you're like, everything to have a problem, I don't know where I'm going with this, what do I do? And I invited Dr. Magnifico because she's going to tell you about her own journey doing research and some of her own issues dealing with research design that at some point seemed to work, and at some point apparently it kind of didn't work as they expected, and how they navigated that. So, and then as she's talking, feel free to jump in and ask questions. The only thing is when you might need to get a little closer to the camera, to the webcam, so she can hear you. The microphone is potent, but I don't think you can hear everyone in the back, so just come a little closer so she can hear you, and speak loudly enough that we can actually record. So this is all my talking I'm going to do pretty much for today. Alecia, we're all yours.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, it's really wonderful to be talking with all of you. Like Raul says, I study literacies, I study online literacies, I work with teachers, I work mostly with teachers who are also either going to be master students or already master students like you. And they're starting to think about some of the same things. How does it work to get into a classroom and do research and develop different kinds of questions about what you see happening in schools. And Raul, did you tell me again what you ended up assigning for reading? Did you assign the LCSI paper and the Writing in the Wild paper? Or?
Yes, I gave them the three readings.
Okay.
And the slides, the annotated slides.
Okay, beautiful, fantastic. So I thought maybe it might actually be useful to start off with a talk that Jane Lammers and I gave about that LCSI paper. Just thinking about, just because that paper thinks about the longer trajectory of our research, and in many ways, like, tells a story about how we screwed up. And I think, and it's not, and I don't think it's a negative story about how we screwed up. I think it's a story about beginning from a particular place in time and space. I mean, I imagine Raul and all of you have had lots and lots of conversations about how literacies are situated in particular contexts, and how the learning that students do in your classroom is going to be a little bit different from the learning that students do in other kinds of places. And in many ways, I feel like that is like this talk and this set of papers is about that, like being in a context and realizing that you are in a context, and sometimes even many years later, realizing how that context affects how you see the world and how you might need to do a little bit of work to unpack that. So that I think is really is the story of this work in many ways. So I thought that I might start there. What I'm going to do is, where did this, okay, here we go. Here's the screen share button. I'm actually going to share my screen with you and just talk through the first couple of slides in this particular talk. This was a talk that we gave at, that we were invited to give actually at AAAL, which is a talk for applied linguists. Do you do AAAL, Raul?
No, I usually don't.
No, I never had either. I had some super interesting conversations there, but I had never been to that particular conference before. So in many ways, I feel like the beginning of this talk is useful too, because it is all about presenting this work to a slightly different audience. I just realized my door was open and there's people meeting in the hall. So I'm gonna close it, just in case it gets loud. Okay. So this talk is based on that paper in Learning, Culture, and Social Interaction. And we decided to call it Looking Back and Thinking Ahead, Charting New Directions in Online Fan Fiction Research. Can you see my screen at this point, or can you still see me?
Can you actually like show the full, show the slides in full screen?
Oh, do you not see them in full screen?
No.
Okay. Try that. That work?
No, actually now we see your notes.
Oh, now you've got my notes. Okay. How do what I would like to be able to do.
Look at the bottom where you have the slideshow button.
Okay, hold on. So nope, that's wrong. Okay. All right, so let's, okay, I think I just need to do this full screen from here, which is now, where did PowerPoint move show in full screen, guys? This is crazy pants. Okay, here we go. Better? Okay, beautiful. So the first thing that we talked about when we gave this talk was our previous writing research, and how that came from classroom spaces, probably much like the ones that you all teach in, but also online spaces like the Hunger Games, like Neopets, like Jane worked extensively with kids who were writing about The Sims. And we really looked across all of these different contexts to try to understand how students, and students of many ages really, were learning to read and write. Some for the first time in English, some who were native English speakers, and who were taking up either a new context, or playing a game with people who they really liked, and deciding to write stories and do research there. And a lot of what we thought about in this particular research was that how in school spaces and in adult-led spaces like writing circles, or like extracurricular programs, often those outcomes and those curricula were really very much led by teachers or mentors. Like there was this very strong idea that that everybody was going to be learning the same kind of content, And everybody was going to be moving towards the same kind of outcome, right? Like you all know this, right? Like you've all written learning objectives. You're hoping that everybody in your class gets to a place where you feel like you can say, okay, this is, they meet this particular objective. They've gained this particular skill. They can write or read in this way where they couldn't write or read in this way before. Very different from online affinity spaces, where really people are doing all different kinds of things, and they're doing it in a self-guided way. So if you potentially see like the reading and writing that happens in schools and in spaces where teachers are leading as content creation, right? Like maybe you sit down and you say to your students, okay, we're going to write a research essay, or we're going to write a personal story, or we're going to write an analysis of something that happened in the world. You might think of all of that as content creation, and your students are all doing some work starting from a place where maybe they're novices and they've never done research before, or they've never written in English before, and they're moving towards a place where they can do that thing. In online affinity spaces, how did this work? Okay, so over on the left-hand side, that's one thing that people can do, right? Like it is, in fan fiction spaces, yes, there are the fan fiction authors. How many of you have ever written or read fan fiction, by the way? Nobody? Maybe one. How many of you have ever participated in some kind of online group, like a Reddit board, or a big multiplayer game, or anything like that? Do you guys do that? Yes, some people. Okay. So those of you who have been in those kinds of spaces, you know that you can do lots of different things. If you're playing a big multiplayer game, you can get online and you can play the game with people. But you can also post cheat codes. You can also post strategies. You can also go on Reddit and watch videos or read posts about how people solved a particular raid or a particular level. Some people make art about the game. Some people share stories about the game, right? Like all of these things are valued kinds of participation. And that's really different from classrooms. So in classrooms, we're always hoping that all of our students learn to meet whatever content objective that we've set as teachers. In online spaces, I mean, it can be totally legitimate and also totally fun just to like sit on Twitter and share out the different resources that you've discovered. Maybe you find a really cool gaming video. Maybe you find a really cool fan fiction story. Like absolutely legitimate participation to share that out. And so when we started this research, we started with the idea fundamentally that online spaces were like classroom communities of practice, in that I wish I was actually there to like animate this for you, because it is not an animated slide. But we started with this idea that people who were new to a particular space might start with sharing things out on Twitter, like showing their appreciation, or putting hearts on a story, or reviewing a story, or making art about a story. But ultimately that people would, so like if you can imagine starting on the outside of the spider web, and then working their way towards the inside of the spider web, where we imagine the inside of the spider web would be that content creation space where they were doing where they were writing stories and then getting reviews from other people and other users, or getting hearts from folks who had read their story. But what we realized over time was that that's actually kind of a terrible metaphor for online space work, largely because, I mean, if we go backwards here, like I just said, all of these different kinds of participation are important in an affinity space. If everybody was writing stories, then there might be nobody to review the stories. If everybody was just reviewing stories, then you'd run out of stories to read. Like, if nobody was sharing these things on different fanfiction.net boards, on Twitter, on Tumblr, wherever, the community might not ever get any bigger. And so what we realized was that essentially a spider web is not about an individual path. And an online community is not about a standard novice to expert trajectory. And we realized that what we really wanted was to see much more of all of the spaces in the web and all of the people who participate in all of the different, you might say, core content practices versus ancillary practices that they use when they do that. So you might recognize this as a communities of practice model. Raul, have you talked about communities of practice at all?
Not in this class. I mean, I'm hoping that maybe at some point in the literacy class
Okay.
We'll tackle that.
Okay. Well, all right. I'll talk a little bit through that. But anyway, so we conceptualize affinity spaces as spaces where people interact around a common interest or activity. And that big word interact that means a lot of different things, we mean that intentionally broadly. And participating in these spaces offers lots of different interest-driven trajectories, lots of different paths towards becoming a participant. The people who share stuff are valued. The people who write stories are valued. The people who make art are valued. The people who just play are valued. All of those things are things that you can do as a participant. And the theory thinks about learning in spaces, like we say affinity spaces, in order to pull the focus away from individuals. So in classrooms, again, we're typically thinking about each student progressing towards a common objective. And here online, what we're thinking more about is dispersed collaborative networks that need people doing different kinds of things to make them work and to make them dynamic. So some people create content. Those are in fanfiction. Those are the fanfiction writers. They're highly visible. Most of the research on fanfiction is about those people who write fanfiction stories. But these ancillary practices like sharing, like reviewing, like liking, like hearting, those support the main activity of an affinity space. And in a fandom that loves the writers, there are still a whole bunch of ancillary practices, including lurking, right? Like, how many of you who have ever found some online message board that you're fascinated by, but you're really scared to post on, right? That's still legitimate participation. They need people like you. Maybe some of you will eventually post on those boards. Maybe some of you will never post on those boards. It doesn't really matter. We need people to read and to write and to interact. And moreover, what the writers in our studies, because we too were people who did a lot of studies on writers, they told us that participants who read and share and comment or review are really important to them. We have all kinds of comments about I love fan mail. Fan mail is fantastic. It doesn't matter if they just mail me and say your story is great. Like that still motivates me to keep going. As teachers, we often think about teaching our students to give good feedback. And what we mean by good feedback is tell them something you liked, tell them some question that you had, tell them something that you think could be improved, right? Like we all know that you need the positive feedback, you need the critical feedback too. But the writers in our fan fiction studies in online spaces kept telling us, no, the fan mail is useful. The hearts are useful. It matters and it doesn't matter if I get good feedback that tells me how to improve, because I know people are reading my work, and that is one thing that motivates me highly. So in other words, when you have big dispersed networks that are looking at both central and ancillary practices, or that are doing, people in those networks are doing both central and ancillary practices, that makes up the space of the interaction. So whereas we started in this very teacher-like space of thinking about novice participants and how they would gain expertise in whatever the main activity was, now we're thinking much more about the whole web and how the different kinds of activities can support the aim of whatever that space looks like as a whole. So we moved from, so in many ways, actually, this is a theoretical mistake that led to a methodological transformation, because we moved too from interviewing fan fiction writers to trying to understand the kind of language that actually happened in those online writing communities. So this is one of those places where we felt like we got it wrong, and have been working on transforming basically everything about this research in reaction to that first kind of take on being a novice in an online affinity space versus being an expert in an online affinity space, and what that meant. So I'm going to stop with the slides here and make some space for you all. But the major point that I want to make, okay, we'll go back to me. All right, can you see me again? Yes? Okay, cool. But the major point that I want to make here is that even if you feel like you get it wrong, what you're doing in that time and in those kinds of spaces is you're learning something. We learned a lot about our own, we learned a lot about fan fiction writers. We also learned a lot about ourselves as teachers and ourselves as researchers. And it really gave us a lot of space to rework the questions that we were asking. So in some ways it's like a beautiful mistake, right? Because it's a beautiful new set of insights and new set of things to examine. And I expect that many of you are going to find really similar stuff as you begin to work with your own research studies. So why don't I turn the floor over to you, just thinking through that idea of really generative, really amazing mistakes in some ways, the mistakes that like give you whole new directions. And tell me more about what kinds of questions you have and what kinds of conversations you want to have while you've got me here on Zoom.
Door is open, so somebody take plunge. While they're thinking, Alecia, while they're thinking, because probably they're now trying to figure out, I really like what you said, that even when you do something wrong, you learn something about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a little more on what that meant and that particular project that you talked about in slides?
Do you want me to tell the methods story? Do you want me to tell the story of like the papers and the ideas that have come after it? Like, where do you? I feel like I could take that a bunch of different directions.
Take it. Yeah. Take it in any one direction you want. I think whichever way you go, it will be insightful for the students.
Okay. Let's see. So you told me before that you all were starting to work on methods ideas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. So at the very beginning of this work, it was pretty common for studies of online research to focus on people who were participating in spaces. So if you were interested in studying a game, you would interview the gamers. If you were interested in studying people who wrote fan fiction, you would interview the fan fiction writers. And often those studies picked people who now we call exceptional cases, people who were real experts. So we interviewed, for instance, fan fiction writers who had written like novel-length fan fiction stories, like many hundreds of thousands of words. Jane Lammers' papers about Laura are really good examples of those, like really kind of delving into the practice of particular writers and what they did, how they collaborated, how they got their ideas, how they shared their work, what they found motivating and interesting, like to kind of flesh out how this was different from school writing. So largely that was interview methods, and from there we built case studies, and they were very focused often on individual writers. And I realize now that comes from very much a communities of practice kinds of theoretical space, where what learning in a community is starting off as a novice and engaging in a bunch of Levenwenger say peripheral practices, a bunch of low-level kinds of things at first, and then gradually moving towards the space wherever they can do whatever the main activity is. Lots of classrooms work like that too. In English classrooms, frequently you'll start off writing really short things at first. Like maybe you'll just write a couple of snippets, and over time you'll build it into something longer. And so I think almost without realizing it, we ended up in that space of kind of replicating the idea of learning has one particular trajectory, and that trajectory is the main activity. But okay, so that's case study methodology. What we realized in the course of talking to folks, like I said, was that they really valued a lot of the interaction they had with other users, with people who read their stories, with people who made art about their stories, with people who wrote complementary chapters, or wanted to write some kind of collaborative thing. And so as we were starting to make this shift, largely what we did was we had a whole lot of different conversations about okay, so we're beginning to realize that really all of these ancillary practices are not ancillary at all. They're vital. They're important parts of the whole network. How do we study them? And part of the answer to that question is it can be really difficult, because getting back-end data on a site that you did not build yourself is in many cases almost impossible. So like we felt from early on that it was going to be really difficult to be able to get a sense of people's lurking, for instance, or to get a sense of how people read and hearted or liked, or whatever the site allows, various stories or various kinds of art. But we knew that writers valued reviews, and we knew that reviews left traces, right? Like when you review something, or when you reply or make a comment to something, you can see that text. So basically the first step that we took, and that we've been working with lately, was this idea of trying to understand what's happening in those reviews. Like, are those reviews mostly like, good job, I love your story, like fan mail kinds of things? Are those reviews, like, do you start to get into these ideas of good feedback? Are those reviews critical? Do they make suggestions for changes? And that's where we've been in more recent history, and just trying to understand what's happening in the wider web through looking at a wider swath of language. And then just recently, you will also see, if you read any of my or our early work, that we talk a lot about, okay, it seems like these online spaces might be really good inspiration for creating more choice in classrooms, or creating different kinds of curricula, or working with teachers in new ways. And this summer, Jane and I taught a fan fiction course to teachers. And we're trying to put some of that into practice, and think through what kinds of online space practices are possible in classrooms, and what kinds of practices and ideas are not. So that's, and again, we're kind of going back to case study there, because we're focused on those individual teachers who took our class, but hoping that working through teachers to get a sense of the wider classroom practices. Does that make sense? Or is that what you were asking, Raul?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm thinking about the students in the class, and thinking they're trying to figure out everything with the methods. Making decisions about who we're talking about today, about that, whether we're going to do observations or interviews, or which one goes first, which one is going to, the main data source is going to drive the research study, and making all those decisions. I mean, it's whichever decision you make, as you said, it's going to take you in one particular direction.
Right.
So that's why I wanted to ask the question about when you said that even when you get something wrong, because and one of the main points that I really want to get out for the students is that sometimes it's okay to be confused.
Yeah.
It's okay if you don't get it first. Like, I mean, I told you when you told me about this at ARA in April, I really love the story. Family said, no, it's kind of quote unquote screwed up. And I think, because I mean, those stories need to be told.
Yeah.
And so, because I mean, if you have an experienced researcher telling the class, yeah, this happened and this is how we compounded the mistake, so to speak. Because I don't think there was a mistake, there was just, there was a miscalculation that whereas somewhere, and we just recalibrate. Right. And it's important to hear the stories of how that recalibration can happen. Because they cannot expect that they have to go from point A to point B in a straight line. When the research is there is no straight line.
Would it be helpful for me to show it to you in research questions?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I'm gonna have to do some digging through old manuscripts to do that, because I don't actually totally remember what the old research questions looked like. But I wonder if that might be an interesting way to think about this.
Yeah, I think,
So,
does that work for you guys?
Yeah.
okay. So let's see. So what if we pull, all right. What if we find out what the heck the dissertation questions or my dissertation research questions are?
You still remember that?
No, I'm going to get my dissertation out and tell you.
No, that's what I was thinking, like, I was like, okay, I will just tell them, Google my dissertation, because I don't remember.
Oh, Lord, no, I have no idea what's in here, which is why I am pulling it out so I can actually read the research questions to you. Okay, so let's find out what my dissertation research questions were. I have no idea what Jane's or Jen's were, but I can tell you, okay, here we go. So let's see. So my dissertation, right, I forgot that you guys are not on screen share. I'm gonna put you back on screen share so you can actually see this. Okay. All right, so now you can see that. And now I have to move my face so I can read the research questions. So for my dissertation, let's see, I say, I focus on 3 major research questions about these communities and audiences. And like I said before, I was working with an English classroom. I was working with an in-person writer circle that was designed by professional writers. And I was working with like an online writer circle through the game Neopets. So that's what these communities are. So we have, how is each of these creative writing communities structured or designed at the group level? What group level structures seem especially salient to participants' writing experiences, and how do they affect those experiences? So there I was thinking about like, I was essentially thinking about classroom and curriculum. So what kinds of curricular structures or what kinds of collaboration was designed for that group? For the Neopets group, a lot of them, they designed their own things. They designed their own collaborations. They decided to write together for particular events. They decided to try and get their Neopets fiction published in different venues. For the classroom and for the writer's circle, it was much more about the mentors or the teachers designing a series of activities. So that's research question 1. Research question 2 was, what motivates individual participants to take part in creative writing communities, both formal and informal? What do we learn about individuals writing by examining their goals and motivations to write? And there we're looking at, here's where we start to look at writers, and particularly, why do writers do what they do? What do we learn about individual writers by looking at why they make the choices they do? And there is a bunch of findings there that will not surprise anybody at all. A lot of the students in the classroom wrote something that they felt like was going to be acceptable for their teacher. And they made choices about what to write and how to write that reflected the classroom. What's interesting is that was actually really similar for a lot of the Neopets work. They were making choices about things to write that they could publish in Neopets venues, because doing that would lead to, there's special avatars for special achievements in Neopets. So many of them were writing for the avatar, which meant that their writings were pretty significantly driven by publication requirements. Does sound familiar to you, Raul? It's kind of like writing for tenure in the land of Neopets, which is sort of funny to reflect on. Many of them too were writing to create more of an immersive world. Neopets doesn't really have a lot of tools for like character creation or imagining the personality of your Neopet and how you interact with your Neopet. So many of them were doing that kind of creative work as well. So that's like individual goals kinds of stuff. And then finally, does the audience of a creative writing community impact participants' motivation to write and their development as writers? And this is the question around things like fan mail and around things like feedback. How do writers use feedback? How do writers pay attention to feedback? Do writers pay attention to feedback? So these were my dissertation questions. So I was interested in basically groups, individuals, and audiences.
I'm gonna pick your brain about the questions, Alecia, for a second.
You have questions? Perfect.
I'm gonna pick your brain about the questions because right now everybody is in the process of thinking, overthinking, and rethinking the research questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like in your case, I mean, I know in my case it took me a while to get my questions, to a point that they were presented. How many revisions do you recall you had to do the research questions until we got to the point that this is what you have, and this is what I say, okay, this is presentable enough that I can just show it to the community?
How many revisions did I do on these questions?
Yeah.
A lot. Yes. Let's see. We could, I'm trying to, let's see. Well, there's a whole bunch of different, oh Lord. I mean, there's lots of different ways that you could potentially take that. I mean, the short version is a heck of a lot. I mean, like, even if you just look at my drafts of final chapters folder, you can see that there's a whole lot of them. This is, so my motivation and goals chapter, let's see. And this is post-research question, right? Like, there are 16 drafts in here post-research question, and this is one part of my dissertation, right? So, but yeah, I would say that this went through significant revision. Wait, hold on. What I'm trying to find is, where's my dissertation proposal? It might be in here or in here. But I'm not actually sure how much, here we go, how much revision I did from proposal to dissertation. But we can find that too.
The point is, it took several, and even the question, even while you were doing the field work, you needed to go back and look at the questions were actually taking you somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, data analysis, sites of data collection. Where is my damn questions, people? They're in here somewhere. Here we go, page 8. Okay.
Can you refresh the share button, because I think you've got.
Oh, weird. Yeah, why did that, okay. Hi, go. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna go all the way back to sharing. Oh, I know why. I switched applications.
Okay. Fair enough.
Sorry about that. Okay, research questions. So, in my proposal, we have, okay, so what motivates individual participants to take part in creative writing communities, both formal and informal? Do these factors seem to affect the development of individual writing process? So there I feel like I see a shift from imagining that I was going to trace individuals' writing processes to the idea that what I really wanted to know about was their goals, and their ideas about why they were participating, which is a little bit different from individual writing process. The second one is pretty similar. How are these communities structured or designed at the group level? What group level structures seem especially salient? So I definitely was interested in things like curriculum and things like structures from the beginning. And does the audience have a creative writing community? And that one's pretty similar too. So I feel like the most significant revision happened up in here, around what I was thinking about doing. And largely, I feel like initially I was really thinking about this as ethnographic research. Like I was going to spend, by the way, all of you, this is a terrible dissertation. Not in that it turned out terribly, but this thing is huge. Like it's 3 spaces and 2, no, it's not 2 mentors, because there was a teacher in the classroom and 5 mentors in the writer circle community, and like 10 participants in each space. Don't do this. This is too much. Like I actually, these days, I am very, very divided about even giving my dissertation proposal or giving my dissertation to my graduate students as a thing to read as a genre example, because I was my advisor's first graduate student, and she let me do this because I was really excited about this. This is a terrible idea. Like, make it smaller. It's okay to make it smaller, just so you know.
Yeah.
And I tell my grad students that too, and sometimes they don't believe me.
No, and I appreciate you saying that, because I mean, you have like, because you have that 3 questions that are actually 5.
Yeah.
I mean, you have like that. You have like every research question has something. It's like it's
yes.
That really, I mean, that the amount of data you had to collect in order to answer those questions was pretty large.
Absolutely.
So probably in your case, you might want to go with just 1 question.
Yes.
I only make sure there's only 1 question mark in that question. If you have 1 question mark, we're gonna make your life more complicated than it should be.
Or, you know, I mean, you might have one cluster of questions. So like if we go back to my actual dissertation, and again, I think, yeah, I know. Okay. If we go back to the actual dissertation, like one of these things, like an area of questioning that has maybe 2 questions, that's probably fine. But yes, there are what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6 questions here. Yeah. And the reality is that I did end up narrowing in various ways as I wrote. And largely what I found was that it was really almost impossible to work with all of these things at the same time, which is part of the reason that that what you see published from my dissertation is almost exclusively individual articles. So yeah, but so basically the point was, these were my initial questions. And as you can see, they're really big. Like I had big questions about curriculum and designing learning spaces. I had big questions about individual goals. I had big questions about audiences, and the way that audiences interact with people. And this is a dissertation. Like, this is not a master's thesis. I could show you that too if you want. I don't know. It might be more interesting to actually look at more of the trajectory stuff, because what I was going to do was to contrast that with, hang on, I need to go digging through some folders again.
Yeah, so you can see we love folders.
Say that again, Rahul.
I'm saying that we love folders, and that folders are important. I mean, we were in the class. We talked a little bit about that this is a good time to have to be very organized with the data storage.
Yes. Oh God. Yes. Folders. I love my folders. Folders are very important. Yeah. Where is the final print?
Organization folders matters. Okay. If you want to drive yourselves, any advice is crazy.
All right. So here, and all right. I shared some of the other questions, some of the sort of mid-level questions with you. Let me show you one of the newer papers. And this even feels sort of old. But this is the first paper that Jane and Jen and I wrote while we were making that transition from thinking about the individual paths to thinking about the space surrounding. So for instance, we see here some of the origin in the introduction, research across fields as well as popular press highlighting young artists shows that some exceptional young writers have used the internet to build networks of fan fiction writing and English language learning. Have you read that paper with your class, Raul?
No.
That's a great paper. I love that one.
I don't think.
Yeah. Anyway.
Spaces has read this one, but.
Okay, got it. Conduct public service projects and establish fashion magazines. We know that young people are motivated to engage in persistent such projects as they develop relationships with their readers, reviewers, and collaborators. There's the audience piece. But then we do this. It is difficult to assess the commonality of such experiences. Can we expect that all young people will find themselves interacting with global readers or viewers? And we know that the answer to that question is no. So here, what we decided to try to do was to attempt to better understand the interaction among authors, readers, and commenters, and what that does. So here, the research questions are right here. Oh, good. This one is actually one question. Specifically, we ask, what are the primary characteristics of formative feedback in fanfiction online writing spaces? And then from there, what we did was we built we adapted really a series of iterations of coding, looking at reviews and looking at what reviewers and authors say to each other, and what we might be able to learn from that. Basically theorizing that there are more people who are reviewers and commenters than who are writers themselves. So do you feel like that helps, like, to get a sense of how the questions change over time?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's important for them to understand that the question, even the question they're posing right now, it's going to change early next year, once they start working with once they have their thesis director assignment, it will change.
Yeah, no. And it's good for it to change because again, I mean, especially with your master's thesis, you have a lot to learn at that point. And it's okay. It's okay, and it's encouraged to be learning things. I mean, I think that this can be really a hard thing to think about, particularly for those of us who are also teachers, right? Because it's like you get into your classroom and you feel like your students expect you to have answers and expect you to be correct about those answers. But research is a process of learning and revision. My one mentor that Raul and I share, Bill Cope, Bill, and I used to be appalled by this. Bill loves to say, just write the paper. If you were wrong, don't worry about it. 3 years from now, you can just write another paper and tell everybody about how you were wrong. It's just another paper. And did Bill ever say that to you, Raul?
No, not at the point where I don't think he wanted to tell me that when I was working on my dissertation. Yeah, write a dissertation. If it's wrong, write another one. I don't think that would work at that stage.
Yeah.
That scared me.
Yeah, no, fair enough. But he said that to me a bunch of times as a postdoc.
Okay.
And I think the first time I nearly fell over. I was like, wait, what? You expect me to go through all of this and to like try and publish this thing and then to tell the world I was wrong about it? I mean, come on. But I think it's really true. And I think that it's evidence of thinking that is actually evolving.
No, I think there is a sense of value in telling the stories of where things don't work for us. I think value in that, and you and I have talked about this and how all this posturing that happens in academia so often is not good for the students because they expect everybody to have it all figured out, that we all know exactly where we're going, and you go to conferences and you realize that sometimes what people present it's things that are in motion. Sometimes you go to a conference, you can even aid your race sometimes. You go with something really well thought out, but you realize it's still going. So it's not fully finished. And that even when you write a thesis, what you present is what you managed to get at that particular point, but that the story may be far from over.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how many of you feel like you know the answers at this point?
Yeah, how many of you got an idea what the answer is going on?
That's okay. In some ways that's better. It means that you can be really open to learning and to really paying attention to what's happening around you.
Yeah, question? Yeah. Can you get a little closer to the microphone? So, yeah, just put yeah, exactly. So she can hear you. Because sometimes the microphone. So there is one question. Brave Soul Ventures was a question.
Fantastic.
Okay, good morning, Dr. Magnifico. Thanks for being with us. My question is more general because the stuff that is happening here, in my case, I know some of my classmates, is just we are just beginning to the long path of research. Yeah?
Yep.
So I can say that we are rookie researchers. And my question is, you have the research question is you advance with the statement of the problem, conceptual framework, but at one point you realize that you have to go backwards and begin from scratch. So what is your recommendation? I mean, because it is frustrating. It's frustrating when you have worked one semester or more than one semester, and then you realize, so how can we redirect and we focus that energy and motivation that we had at the beginning to begin again?
Okay, so let's see. First of all, let me say, absolutely, that kind of realization and that kind of revision can be really frustrating. I get that, absolutely. It's really hard to have people tell you that you are wrong. It's really hard to realize for yourself that you were really wrong. Absolutely. So are you asking about are you asking about practical advice for revision? Or yes, you are asking about practical advice for revision. I would say a couple things. The first thing that I would say is before you commit to doing a major revision, talk to a couple of people about it. Because there have definitely been moments, many moments in my past where I suddenly felt really uncomfortable with one of my ideas, like it might need major revision. And I went to talk to an advisor, or I went to talk to some of my colleagues. And they have looked at me and they have said, actually, I think that's a finding. Actually, I think that this is something that you should write about and that you should try to teach the world. Because maybe what you've identified is some kind of mismatch between the existing theory that you had and something that you're seeing happen. In many ways, I think that this spiderweb question was one of those for me and Jane and Jen. At first it was, oh my God, we were wrong. What do we do? But over time, it became, wait a minute, this is a finding. The field has been speaking in terms of these expert writers, but what the expert writers are telling us is that a whole bunch of other people are important there. Maybe we need to tell that story. So, I mean, I would say my first piece of advice is talk it over before you throw the work out. That's piece number one. Go see Raul. Go talk to somebody else in your class. You know, like if do you have committee members for your master's thesis?
They will, but not yet. I mean, still,
you will?
Already still in the game. I mean, they will have them.
Okay. Talk to a committee member.
Yeah.
Like, especially if you have a committee member who tends to see things a little bit differently, talk to a committee member. Because sometimes you might find that what you see as a revision is something really exciting. So that could be cool. If you do decide that you have to revise, I would recommend, what do I recommend? I would recommend trying to be easy on yourself. So when you start to do a big revision, take it slowly. Because it's true, like Raul was just saying, like sometimes there's a lot of emotion in this work. And it can be very difficult to do that. So when I'm trying to work on a big revision, what I often try to do is to give myself a short amount of time each day, like maybe even half an hour a day, to sit down and to theoretical framing, or you might consider looking at your data in a slightly different way, and to try to do that over time for like half an hour a day, because often early in a big revision, that's all I can take. Like, yeah. And working on it and just touching it a little bit over time often helps a lot more than like pushing myself really hard and working on it and saying, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to work on this for 8 hours. That usually ends with me really exhausted and not wanting to look at it for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So I would say those are my 2 pieces of practical advice: is talk to other people about it and take it slow.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Another brave soul is going to ask a question.
Fantastic.
Hi, nice to meet
Hi.
you. So, as we're talking about data collection methods, I was thinking about observations. They're something that we choose to do frequently.
Okay.
So when I was in the undergraduate program, I went to an institution, to a classroom, to observe and to find a problem that I could solve somehow.
Okay.
But in this master's program, I already have an issue, a situation.
Okay.
So when I go to observe, should I have my mind naked, or should I have already the purpose of what I'm going to observe? Because when I read your paper, I saw that every single data collection method have a clear purpose. So I was thinking, should I have it already designed on my mind, or should I go and then see what I'm going to do with the data?
That's a great question. Let's see. I think, especially as a master's student, I would say that my advice there would be to try to do a little bit of both. I mean, at this point, what you're looking at when you read my work and when you read my work with Jane and Jen, I mean, we've been writing with each other since 2009. We have, and each of us came into that with our own work. So when you read our work, you're looking at like a dozen years of thinking through these particular issues. So we have some pretty settled ideas about what we're doing with those observations. We have some pretty significant experience in terms of what we've tried in the past. And as you can see, like, this is, this came 7 or 8 years in. So still, even then, like, you need those major revisions sometimes. I would say, as a master's student, if you feel like you have something that you want to talk about, doing some observations, and it sounds like maybe you've already done some observations on this particular thing that you want to talk about. Is that right? You have? Yeah. Okay. I would say to try to do some writing about those observations and, like, get clear in your mind how you're thinking about them and what your like internal theoretical framework looks like. And you might ask yourself some questions. There's some, hang on a sec. Do I have it? This book. This is an old edition of this book, but in the new edition of this book, Becoming Qualitative Researchers by Glesny, there's a lot of really great reflective questions for researchers. And what she encourages people to do when she talks about ethnography is both to make those observations, but then to try to think about them from a bunch of different directions. So you might ask yourself, okay, why do I, as a teacher, feel like this is a problem or this is a major issue? And then you might try and kind of work through some different perspectives. Like, would administrators think that this was a problem? Would parents think this was a problem? Would students think that this was a problem? What's my evidence for those perspectives? You could try to talk to some students. You could try to talk to some parents. You could try to talk to a colleague. And I think that kind of reflective writing early in your research helps you get to the research question. And as you're formulating the research question, then you might start to make like more targeted observations of whatever it is becomes most salient. Like, so I don't know. So maybe I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Maybe you're studying something like writer's agency and identity, and you're really interested in like the moment where your students start to see themselves as writers. And it could be that as you're doing reflective writing and as you're doing that kind of observation, you find that there's a particular activity where a bunch of students really do start to see themselves as writers, but others are like, no, that's really scary, I can't do this thing. And if you're in that situation, then maybe you look particularly at that activity with your research question. And you say, this particular thing that I do in my classroom seems to be this flashpoint, right? Some people get really excited about it. Some people get really turned off by it. What's going on there? So the initial observations might even be the way for you to get to your research question. And then once you have a research question, I think you can start to worry a lot less about making your mind naked and start worrying about, okay, I've identified this thing. I feel pretty confident about this thing. How do I look at it in a targeted kind of way? Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. You're welcome.
Do you have another question? Okay, just come forward. One more question.
Okay.
Okay, good morning. My name is
Hi,
Nick.
good morning.
Probably continue with the idea that you were saying before, and it's related to the position of the researcher when you're starting doing your idea of the model that you want to have. My question is related, like, what was your position when you started thinking about this project? And since you were working with other two people, like how those perceptions or positions were connected in order to get with the idea that you were trying to do. I mean, what was like the experience that you had before? So you came into that topic, and finally how they were connected with the other two people that you were working with. Because I want to make some clarification, like you were talking about emotions and how to put yourself in what you're investigating. And my question is important, what Eliana said before, it's in what moment you put yourself like aside of what you're trying to get, and that you don't feel like what you're trying to investigate is because of you, but not because the participants. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're trying to get that idea.
Yeah, no, I think I know what you mean. I think, so let me see if I can try to clarify. It sounds like you're asking a question about research positionality, and it almost sounds like are you worrying about trying to be objective about the situation? Like, are you worried that you can't be objective about whatever situation you're observing?
It's because as my position is very related to the study,
okay.
I don't want to feel like I'm doing this because of the ideas that I have, of the situations that I lived in the past, or because I want to find something related to my own history, but also because there are some participants that probably are living something different, and I don't want, it's like at what point your position as a researcher is going to affect the study itself.
So first of all, yes, I agree with you completely. Your position as a researcher is absolutely going to affect the study itself, and that is okay. In fact, I would say that people who tell you that researchers are, particularly qualitative researchers, are objective people, I think that they are wrong, basically. I don't think that it's avoidable to bring some sense of your own positionality into a study. Like I was just saying, I think that one thing that is important for researchers is to try to do not just observation, but enough reflective writing that you map out what that positionality is. I think it's important for us as researchers to try to think about our own histories, to try to think about where our own histories might be creating various interpretations of data. I think that one way that that researchers try to address their own positionality is through practices like member checking, where you're working with your own writing, but also regularly sharing that writing and regularly sharing those observations with the participants in your study, and trying to think about and trying to think really hard about the places where they say to you, no, I'm not sure that you've got that right. Or the places where they say, well, that's not really what I meant. What I actually meant was this thing over here. And I think that member checking helps you to address your own positionality because it makes other people's viewpoints a lot clearer. So if that's a thing that you want to think and talk about, I would look into, there's a lot of feminist methodology that takes up ideas like that, like member checking, and would give you some practical suggestions for doing that. So that would definitely be the first thing. The second thing is I absolutely feel in my own work that some of those instances of positionality are harder to surface and harder to pay attention to than others are. So for instance, I think that in our affinity spaces research, the way that I can see now that the way that I was approaching it was from a very teacher-centered place. I had this idea that the point of all of these writing spaces was for participants to write. And in the online spaces, that wasn't always true. Like some of them were doing a lot more reading. Some of them were doing a lot more reviewing. But I had this idea that the online space, the school space, and that extracurricular writer circle were going to be fundamentally schoolish in similar kinds of ways. And frankly, I suspect that if I had done that study with colleagues who were not also teachers, I might have seen that a lot sooner. But because I was in a school of education and I was working with a bunch of other teachers, it took us 7 years to really start to be able to see and reckon with that. Like that novice to expert frame was really, really strong and really, really invisible. And yeah, and I think that we see other instances of that all over the place. I mean, I think the entire field of anthropology, right, well, maybe not the entire field, but a big section of the field of anthropology right now is starting to reckon with the fact that anthropology was originally a very colonial endeavor. Like, the whole point of anthropology at first was like, white Englishmen would go to other countries where Britain had colonies and learn what the cultures of those spaces looked like so that they could go in and extract resources without starting a war, basically, right? Like that, and that is a very oppressive lens. And that is a very directed lens, and it's a lens that leads anthropologists to this place of objective expertise that I think does not exist. And this is a conversation that I've started to see at conferences and on Twitter, like, really this year. And anthropology and ethnography, those have been fields and those have been major methods for 100 years. And people are starting to reckon with that now. And so, yeah, I think you're going to have an easier time uncovering some of those positionalities and some of those implicit theoretical frames than others. There will be, you know, I think that some of the harder ones are the ones that come from things that are very deep to your own identity, to things like being a teacher, to things like I'm a white woman, to things like you're a man, right? Like, some of the deeper ones, some of the ones that you're very accustomed to just because you live in that body and you live in that identity, those are the places where I think reflective writing and member checking and talking to other people are most important, because they are most invisible. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Awesome. Great.
Well, I do have two final questions, Jenna, to start wrapping it up. One question is because it has to do with the writing process of the thesis itself, and specifically that there are some students here who have decided to co-author the thesis.
Okay.
And you have a lot of experience with co-authoring, since you have been working with Jen and Jane for a while.
Yep.
What advice would you give these young researchers who are venturing into co-authoring and starting with what is a really tall order, which is the thesis? What advice would you give them in terms of handling and managing the co-authoring process so that it ends successfully?
Okay, so thing number one, that's a great question. And I thing number one, many of you will find that co-authoring does work for you, and you find it really generative and really fabulous. And the person with whom you are co-authoring your thesis right now, be careful, because you might be writing with them for a dozen years, and they may become one of the most important people in your life. So this could be a very long friendship and partnership, which is great. For some people, co-authoring does not work at all. My good friend and colleague Tom Newkirk and I, we have lunch pretty frequently, and we talk about data, and we're both interested in student writers, and we're both interested in fiction writing and fan fiction writing. And what he always says to me is like, Alecia, no, no, I don't co-author things. I can't. I'm too much of a control freak. I love working with you. Let's not wreck it by writing together. And you may find that you are one of those people. who really needs their own space in their own writing. I am one of those people who really loves other people messing with my writing. I find it really exciting, and I find that it pushes my own thinking to work with others really actively. But you may not be that person. So first of all, I would say if you start to write together and it feels terrible, then there is absolutely no shame in deciding to make a different decision. Like if it's better for both of you to not co-author, have that conversation sooner rather than later. Because there's lots of people who just don't, who just feel really bad about it, and that's okay. If you do decide to work together and do decide to co-author things, I would say I have 2 pieces of practical advice. Piece number 1 is get together really regularly. If you're writing something together, I would say try to have a conversation absolutely at least once a week, maybe more than that, just so that you're consistently talking to each other. Remember that thing I said about half an hour ago about like try to work on a revision for half an hour a day? Similarly so with your co-authored pieces. Try to have like a half hour or an hour of conversation with your co-author really, really regularly so that you're moving forward together. And my second piece of practical advice is try to divide up the work fairly and then do your part of it. So for instance, frequently Jen and Jane and I each start a different section of the paper when we're writing a paper together. So I might start in the theoretical framework, and Jane might start in the methods, and Jen might start to think about what the findings are going to be, and then we bring that together and work through it. That works for us pretty smoothly because, like I said before, we've been writing together for like 10 or 12 years at this point. So our voices are pretty meshed. At first it took a lot longer. But yeah, so I would say, so try and divide things up. But then maybe the next week, so that you can get your voices to mesh together a little bit more, work on each other's sections. So if I started the theoretical framework the first week, then maybe Jane would work on the theoretical framework in the second week and I would work on the method or something like that. So that you really are trying to write something pretty cohesively. And I guess my third piece of advice is probably mostly implicit, but I'm going to say it out loud anyway. Do your part. Like don't be that person in a group project who feels really intimidated and then just doesn't do their writing, because that is one really easy way to make a collaboration go very badly very quickly. I mean, and you don't need to be perfect. Like there are absolutely times when we're writing a paper together and like somebody has a whole section and somebody else got totally stuck on what the theoretical framework was going to be, and just has like a list of ideas. And I think maybe we approach it this way. Like that's okay. But just not doing it, that's going to hurt your friendship and it's going to hurt your collaboration pretty irreparably. So yeah. Does that make sense, Raul? What do you think? You do all kinds of collaborative work as well.
Yeah, but actually the difference is like the kind of author I do is more with my researchers, so it's still there is an asymmetrical relationship right there because I'm still the mentor. I mean, I'm still gonna play the role of mentor. When I'm the last author, I'm still playing a certain level of. I mean, I'm still in a mentoring position. It's different. It's very different when you're in a symmetrical level. And that's why I wanted to throw the question, you, Jen, and Jane are very, I mean, are at the same level. And sometimes symmetrical co-authoring brings a
Right.
different set of pitfalls than say a more asymmetrical or co-authoring as part of a mentoring process.
Right.
That has a different, that has a different dynamic. But I understand because, I mean, all the negotiation, I mean, when I co-author with Paulina, I mean, there is a lot of negotiation that is involved, especially because we don't want the paper to mess some of the personal stuff in our lives. And so it's always that give and take, and it's always that negotiation, and it's always that level of necessary conversation. For even if you have a mentoring relationship, you still have to make it in a way that you are respectful to your co-authors, because I mean, they're not just your students, they're your colleagues.
Yeah.
When the paper is published, you're going to be 5 or 6 authors, and there's not going to be a footnote that says author student 5 are author 1 students. I mean, that's not going to be the, you may mention in the article, but it's not going to be anywhere on the database, on Google Scholar for that matter.
Yeah.
So yeah, now there's one final question that I always like to ask when I bring people to research class. On the one hand, because we have novice researchers in the room. And second, this video is going to go to YouTube, to the LSLP channel for the LSLP in-session webinars. So there might be young researchers listening to this.
Okay.
What advice would you give them as someone who's an experienced researcher, but also someone who's mentored younger researchers in terms of getting into the activity and the act of doing research?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so like some piece of practical advice for just basically for novice researchers in terms of like becoming a researcher.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give you the advice that I try to give myself, and I am not perfect at always taking, but I do think is really important. And that is, you and I get more mileage out of my thinking when I'm doing it really regularly. So try to write a little bit every day. Try to touch it, try to think about it, try to do some additional reading and relate it back into the other thing. It doesn't need to be a lot of work, but I find that my own thinking processes and my writing processes are much more effective when I'm doing them really, really regularly. And that's a hard thing when you're a teacher. Sometimes you get sometimes you get very overwhelmed by what's happening in your classroom or what's happening with your students. And that is why I am absolutely not perfect at taking this advice. But when I get in a space when I'm working on a paper or when I'm working on a project, a little bit at a time, it feels like it goes much more smoothly. So that is the piece of practical advice that I would give me and that I would give all of you as well.
I don't know if again. Yeah, because I want to say goodbye. So thank you, Alecia. Thank you very much for what was a very insightful and informational and illustrative session about thinking in terms of research design and thinking of pushing research forward. I think there's some really, really useful advice, and I'm hoping that these young teachers who are starting the journey will find inspiration in some of the suggestions you provided.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for opening up your classroom and giving me the chance to talk with all of you. I wish you really good luck and really good thinking as you start working on your thesis proposals. And I hope that I'm going to get to be able to hear about them as the year goes on. So yes, thank you as well, and be well.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. For the people who will be watching this at some point on YouTube, keep following the LSLP sessions that are going to be a series of webinars that we, at the Literacies project, we are putting together based on classroom conversations with scholars in literacy for their research. So for everyone, thank you very much, and Alecia, I'll see you around sometime soon.
All right. Sounds fantastic.